For eons, the Earth was governed by leviathans. These colossal predators neither required blistering velocity nor clandestine tactics. Their sheer mass and unbridled power guaranteed their dominance over all terrestrial life. Following the sudden departure of the dinosaurs, a widespread belief emerged that the age of monstrous carnivores had vanished into history. Yet reality proves far more nuanced. In the immediate wake of the dinosaurian collapse, a novel cadre of organisms moved in to occupy the vacant throne, lacking the jagged fangs of classic carnivores or the rending talons of the giant reptiles. These successors relied upon rapid movement, keen auditory senses, and beaks of such lethal precision that prey could be neutralized in a matter of seconds. Certain members of this lineage reached heights of nearly 3 meters. Flightless and swift, they haunted the landscape, hunting across the earth, just as their reptilian predecessors once did. This is not the conjecture of science fiction, but a legitimate chapter in planetary annals, a period when birds nearly ascended to become the most terrifying sovereigns of the world. To comprehend this shift, we must return to that critical juncture when the mastery of the land was abruptly surrendered. The extinction of the dinosaurs remains a pivotal milestone in the story of life. Occurring roughly 66 million years ago, a massive asteroid hammered into our planet, striking the region we now identify as the Yucatan Peninsula. An explosion was triggered, releasing energy on par with billions of nuclear warheads, carving out a crater exceeding 180 kilometers in breadth and setting off a sequence of planetary catastrophes. Seismic tremors rippled through the continents, horrific wildfires erupted, and a dense shroud of soot and rock particulate was flung into the stratosphere. For years, the sun was suffocated by this debris, causing global temperatures to plummet. Photosynthesis ground to a halt, triggering the wholesale dissolution of the world's vegetation. As the bedrock of the food chain shattered, terrestrial ecosystems plunged into immediate turmoil. While numerous organismal groups were impacted, the non-avian dinosaurs stood as the primary victims of this collapse. Possessing massive frames and high caloric requirements, they were inextricably tethered to the stability of their environment in a world starved of resources. The very bulk that once cemented their reign transformed into a fatal liability. Within a relatively compressed geological window, non-avian dinosaurs were scrubbed from the face of the earth. This event signaled more than the death of a single group. It signaled the utter destruction of the predators that had occupied the pinnacle of the land-based food chain for upwards of 140 million years. For the first time since the Triassic, the world was vacant of the titans that had long held dominion. This eradication left behind a cavernous ecological void. The status of apex predator, that entity responsible for regulating prey populations and shaping the contours of the environment, was left entirely unclaimed. For millions of years succeeding the catastrophe, no animal group possessed the necessary mass, speed, or lethality to seize the crown. Mammals placentals at the time remained diminutive, nocturnal, and were only just beginning to diversify. Likewise, the massive reptiles that had flourished throughout the Mesozoic era no longer enjoyed their competitive edge in a world that had been fundamentally reorganized. Earth entered a long period of transition, a phase where stability was elusive and terrestrial authority belonged to no singular ruler. In the natural world, however, such voids are rarely permitted to endure. Nature lacks a blueprint, yet it responds unfailingly to opportunity. From this power vacuum, a familiar branch of life began to tread a wildly divergent path, leading toward the emergence of unanticipated heirs. The total disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs fostered the misconception that their lineage had been entirely extinguished. For a significant duration, the dinosaur existed only within the fossil record, literature, and human imagination. However, this perception is fundamentally flawed. In truth, The dinosaurs never fully departed. A singular lineage successfully weathered the asteroid's impact, recalibrated for the post-apocalyptic reality, and proceeded to evolve into the present era. Those survivors are the birds, through the lens of modern biology. Birds are not merely distant relations of the dinosaur. They are, in the strictest taxonomic sense, dinosaurs themselves. Specifically, they belong to the theropod clade, the same lineage that produced such celebrated carnivores as the Allosaurus, the Velociraptor, and the legendary Tyrannosaurus rex. This realization isn't based on a solitary scrap of evidence, but is the culmination of decades of rigorous investigation into anatomy, evolutionary biology, and the fossil record. A multitude of diagnostic traits seen in contemporary birds were manifested quite early within theropod dinosaurs. Lightweight, hollow skeletal structures were utilized to minimize mass. Pneumatic air sac systems were employed to optimize respiratory efficiency, and three-toed, digitigrade feet were developed to facilitate high-speed locomotion. Most notably, feathers made their appearance. Initially, flight was not the purpose of these plumes. Rather, they served functions related to social display, communication, or thermal insulation. Only much later did the capacity for powered flight emerge within certain smaller theropod lineages. Following the Cretaceous-Paleogene cataclysm, those theropods that were diminutive, agile, and capable of rapid adaptation achieved the highest rates of survival. From these few survivors, the vast diversification of modern birds was initiated, today claiming over 10,000 distinct species. Birds rank among the most triumphant groups of animals on the planet, both in raw population counts and in the breadth of their geographic distribution. However, the avian evolutionary narrative was not constrained to a single trajectory. While the majority of modern birds are specialized for aerial maneuvering, allowing them to exploit niche food sources and outpace predators, certain lineages in the post-dinosaurian landscape veered in a radically different direction. They eschewed the skies, preferring to remain earthbound. Instead of undergoing miniaturization, they attained massive proportions. Rather than retreating from hostility, they reclaimed the ecological role their dinosaurian ancestors had once occupied, that of the terrestrial apex predator. It is vital to clarify that this shift represents neither a repetition of history nor a regression, but a novel process of adaptation triggered by a profound ecological vacancy. Once the incumbent apex hunters were erased, selective pressures favored organisms possessing the requisite speed, strength, and versatility to command those positions. Within select habitats, the surviving dinosaurs, the birds, emerged as the ideal candidates for these roles. By abandoning flight to dominate the land, this avian branch began to mirror the silhouette of the colossal hunters that had formerly governed the earth. This path culminated in the rise of one of the most menacing avian factions to ever stalk the world, the terror birds. In the wake of the non-avian dinosaur extinction, the terrestrial realm entered a protracted era of reorganization. During this interval, South America functioned as an effectively sequestered continent, cut off from North America and other major landmasses. This state of isolation fostered a unique laboratory for evolution, where life drifted into morphologies entirely divergent from the rest of the globe. It was amidst these conditions that a family of flightless, predatory avian species began to arise, swiftly assuming the mantle of terrestrial overlords. While scientifically categorized as Phorusrhacidae, they are far more evocatively identified as terror birds. Departing from the flight-dependent survival strategies of modern avian species, terror birds charted a separate course. They cultivated towering frames, utilized powerful, elongated limbs, and wielded curved, reinforced beaks with the sharpness of an axe head. Their necks, though compact, possessed immense muscularity, permitting the transmission of staggering force from the torso into the beak during a strike. This architecture was not intended for the delicate work of pecking at morsels. It was a refined tool set optimized for slaughter. The fossil record indicates that terror birds emerged shortly after the non-avian dinosaurs vanished, followed by a period of rapid diversification across numerous South American habitats. They escalated to the position of primary terrestrial killers, essentially assuming the station formerly held by reptilian carnivores. We must emphasize that this was not a literal return of dinosaurs in the traditional sense, but rather a specific branch of avian dinosaurs reverting to a predatory lifestyle on the ground. At this early juncture, terror birds had yet to evolve into the fearsome titans they would eventually become. Yet the trajectory they pursued was unmistakable. Flight was abandoned. Evasive maneuvers were discarded, and they pivoted to confronting prey directly through sheer violence, velocity, and might. Upon that foundation, the most chilling iterations of these creatures would eventually materialize. Among the various terror birds that graced our planet, one identity is frequently cited as the quintessential embodiment of the family's evolutionary apex Kelenken. Flourishing within the Patagonian expanse of southern Argentina roughly 15 million years ago, during the Miocene epoch, an era when terror birds attained their zenith in terms of power and stature, Kelenken stands as a titan. While not the most massive member of the group by weight, current evidence supports the conclusion that it reached the greatest height ever documented for a terror bird. It is estimated that adults soared to nearly 3 meters in stature, far eclipsing the dimensions of almost any bird species in history and rivaling many of the large mammalian carnivores of their time. The skull of Kelenken alone exceeded 70 centimeters, featuring a thick, heavily hooked beak that signals an extraordinary capacity for resisting impact. The truly startling aspect of Kelenken is not merely its immense scale, but the sophisticated, unified assembly of its anatomy. The cranial and cervical regions were remarkably robust, while the wings underwent reduction, eventually losing their utility for aerial transit. Centered within the torso and hind limbs, the creature's center of gravity betrayed a morphology optimized for sprinting and launching terrestrial assaults. Such features were no accident. They were the manifestation of a deliberate, lethal methodology. By exploiting its towering height to overwhelm quarry, it would dispatch victims through pinpoint strikes of its beak. It is worth noting that while Kelenken is frequently likened to a dinosaur, it functioned as no mere facsimile of a specific extinct reptile. Instead, this represented an autonomous evolutionary path, wherein a flightless avian lineage reclaimed a predatory lifestyle on the ground by repurposing the intrinsic attributes of its theropod forebears. By this point in the chronicle, the terror birds had transcended their role as transient successors. Embodied by species like Kelenken, they had ascended to the throne as the undisputed masters of the terrestrial domain. To grasp the lethality of Kelenken, one must analyze the mechanics of its hunting prowess. In contrast to contemporary carnivorous mammals that rely on sustained bite pressure and canine teeth, the Kelenken and the broader family of terror birds was engineered for bursts of lethal velocity. Investigations into their pedal morphology reveal elongated, slender hind limbs characterized by shortened femurs and extended distal bones, a hallmark of high-speed runners. Given the parallels to flightless avian species such as the ostrich, numerous paleontologists estimate that Kelenken could achieve sprints exceeding 45 kilometers per hour. While this velocity remains a projection derived from skeletal proportions and kinetic modeling, it underscores their efficiency. Yet speed was not its sole offensive asset. The rigidity and scale of its skull implied that the beak was capable of enduring immense impact forces. Rather than engaging in the protracted biting and tearing associated with mammalian hunters, Kelenken could deploy its beak as an axe-like weapon, hammering it downward to inflict catastrophic trauma in a handful of strikes. a powerful, compact neck provided the necessary control to direct these blows while minimizing the risk of self-inflicted injury. Furthermore, one must not overlook their sensory acuity. Analysis of their cranial endocasts indicates that terrorbirds possessed highly developed visual systems, enabling them to pursue prey through semi-open landscapes or dense foliage at high speeds. Simultaneously, the morphology of the inner ear suggests insensitivity to low-frequency acoustics, implying that Kelenken could track the movements of quarry hidden within the undergrowth. While these remain inferences based on avian raptor analogs rather than direct behavioral observation, the conclusion is clear by integrating high-speed pursuit, precise strike mechanics, and sharp sensory tracking. Kelenken had no need for pack tactics or prolonged chasing. A singular instant of exposure for the victim was sufficient to seal its fate. In this era, the terrorbirds had not only filled the ecological vacuum, they had become its ultimate architects. While Kelenken serves as the quintessential model of the terrorbird at its evolutionary zenith, the Phorusrhacidae family was far from a homogeneous group. Over tens of millions of years, they radiated into a vast array of forms, each species representing a specialized survival strategy tailored to its particular niche. Consider Titanis, which inhabited the late Pliocene and early Pleistocene, the waning chapters of the family's saga. Although it stood roughly 2 meters tall, making it diminutive compared to the massive Kelenken of South America, Titanis is distinguished by the breadth of its geographic reach. Unlike the majority of its kin, which were confined to the southern continent, Titanis is the solitary member confirmed to have migrated into North America during the Great American Biotic Interchange, when the Isthmus of Panama bridged the two landmasses. Remains of Titanis had been unearthed in regions ranging from Florida to Texas, demonstrating that these birds were far from ecologically sequestered. They possessed the flexibility to colonize entirely foreign biomes. The presence of Titanis in the north also complicates the narrative regarding the decline of terrorbirds. Having coexisted for eons with indigenous placental carnivores, including ancient canids and saber-toothed felids, it is evident that competition with modern mammals did not necessitate an immediate collapse, provided the environmental conditions remained favorable. Finally, the subject of brontosaurs remains a point of intense controversy, tipping the scales at an estimated 350 to 400 kilograms. It is often lauded as the most massive carnivorous avian in planetary history. If these figures hold, brontosaurs would have outweighed even the largest predatory mammals and modern ostriches. However, it stands as one of the most debated entities in the terrorbird record, due to the scarcity of fossils and the fragmented state of available bone samples. Many researchers express skepticism regarding its classification, with some even questioning if it was truly a predator at all. This deduction rests upon the morphology of its pedal elements and talons, which exhibit characteristics typical of large-bodied, herbivorous avian species. Conversely, a substantial body of research underscores that brontosaurs possessed anatomical hallmarks strictly diagnostic of terrorbirds, particularly concerning the configuration of the thoracic vertebrae and the load-bearing architecture of the skeletal frame. Such features, traditionally associated with massive raptors, imply that brontosaurs remained an integral member of the Phorusrhacidae family, albeit one that pursued a lifestyle divergent from more fleet-footed kin like Titanis or Kelenken. Should we accept that brontosaurs was indeed a carnivore, it is unlikely that it relied upon high-speed pursuit. Instead, given its considerable mass and bulk, it may have transitioned to ambush tactics, haunting open landscapes where it could harness its raw power to overwhelm quarry during fleeting encounters. Nevertheless, one must underscore that this remains purely speculative, as definitive behavioral evidence for this species is still absent. The existence of brontosaurs, Titanis, and their ilk illustrates that the Phorusrhacidae did not represent a monolithic evolutionary branch. Rather, they constituted a diverse array of hunting methodologies, ranging from rapid pursuit to heavy-bodied ambush. This breadth of adaptation sustained their terrestrial dominance for an immense duration. Yet it simultaneously rendered them brittle when environmental conditions shifted inauspiciously. Once those transformations reached a critical threshold, even these ostensibly invincible predators could not evade their decline for vast swaths of time. The terror birds encountered no genuine terrestrial rivals within South America. By virtue of their superior scale, blistering speed, and refined defensive hardware, they maintained the role of apex predator across a myriad of ecosystems. Evolutionary history, however, consistently demonstrates that no authority is absolute. Sustained tenure never guarantees perpetual survival. As the late Miocene drifted into the early Pliocene, the American ecological landscape underwent increasingly complex shifts. A pivotal catalyst arrived with the Great American Biotic Interchange, the epoch when the Isthmus of Panama bridged the northern and southern continents. This geographical coupling enabled a massive cross-continental migration, profoundly reconfiguring the biotic architecture of both regions. Traditionally, the decline of the terror birds was blamed on the influx of placental carnivores from the north, such as bears, ancient canids, and saber-toothed felids, which supposedly exerted competitive pressure that eventually ousted the birds from their supremacy. On the surface, this hypothesis appears robust. Placental carnivores offered distinct advantages, including superior reproductive rates, adaptable hunting tactics, and more efficient thermoregulation. Yet, when fossil data is subjected to rigorous scrutiny, the narrative loses its clarity. Many of the most massive terror bird species had vanished long before their northern mammalian counterparts gained a foothold in South America. Consequently, direct rivalry cannot be cited as the sole culprit, and perhaps it was never the primary driver of their demise. Even the data commonly cited to support the competition model is far from conclusive. Take Titanis, the only terror bird lineage known to have ventured into North America, which not only successfully established itself in these new theaters, but persisted alongside large-bodied carnivorous mammals for a significant duration. Had competitive exclusion been the deciding factor, Titanis should have been purged almost immediately, yet this did not occur. Such observations have compelled paleontologists to reframe their inquiries. Rather than asking which specific species successfully outcompeted the terror birds, we must ask what factors rendered their dominance progressively more fragile. The answer is likely rooted in the inherent biology of the terror birds themselves. As large-bodied predators characterized by protracted lifespans and sluggish reproductive cycles, they flourished within stable, hospitable environments, but proved ill-equipped to survive prolonged, volatile fluctuations. When facing mounting pressures, whether originating from food scarcity, habitat alteration, or external competition, their capacity for recovery was significantly lower than that of smaller, fast-breeding taxa. Thus, their power was likely eroded in a slow, cumulative attrition rather than a sudden collapse. They were not instantly displaced upon the arrival of new rivals. Instead, their status as the untouchable kings of the food chain simply withered away. The initial fissures in this predatory empire had been formed, and the long road to extinction had begun. If rivalry with placental carnivores is insufficient to explain their disappearance, the broader climatic context of the Earth provides a more vital clue. The planet was trapped in a cooling trend that spanned from the late Eocene through the Pliocene, precipitating a series of repetitive ice ages. While this transition was not instantaneous, its cumulative impact was transformative. Tropical regions and dense, humid forests the primary habitats for numerous terror bird species slowly retreated, supplanted by the expansion of cooler, arid savannas. This shift profoundly reshaped the ecological hierarchy, from the primary vegetation to the grazing herbivores, ultimately forcing a transition in the available prey base. When measured against the incoming placental carnivores from the north, the terror birds likely faced a structural disadvantage. Those northern mammals boasted more sophisticated thermoregulation, highly versatile predatory tactics, and, crucially, accelerated reproductive cycles, which allowed them to pivot with greater speed as the environment underwent upheaval. While these comparisons do not serve as direct proof of the bird's defeat, they provide a compelling framework based on ecological divergence. In this light, interspecies competition functioned not as a standalone variable, but as a catalyst that amplified existing stresses. As climate fluctuations constricted their available hunting grounds, the pressure from competitors throttled their access to food. The terror bird populations, being large-bodied and characterized by sluggish breeding patterns, struggled to bounce back from repeated environmental jolts. The outcome was a cascading effect, wherein their once unshakable sovereignty was slowly whittled away. Consequently, the eradication of the terror birds was not triggered by one catastrophic failure, but by the relentless progression of a world that had effectively outgrown their specific biological utility. For many years, the academic consensus held that terror birds had been purged from the fossil record over 1 million years ago, a conclusion that bolstered the theory that they were fundamentally incapable of keeping pace with modern mammalian predators. Yet recent archaeological unearthings have forced a major recalibration of this timeline. Certain diminutive species have been identified that persisted as recently as 96,000 years ago, a window significantly more recent than previously assumed. Such evidence implies that their exit was not a singular event, but a staggered, long-term process, with the gargantuan forms vanishing first, while the smaller lineages endured for tens of millennia afterward. Perhaps most provocatively, fossil fragments unearthed in strata, dating back roughly 18,000 years, suggest the potential existence of an unidentified terror bird lineage. While the identification and dating of these specimens remain subject to fierce scholarly debate, the implications remain tantalizing. Should these remains truly belong to the Phorusrhacidae, it indicates that their disappearance occurred just a heartbeat before the migration of modern humans into South America. While unconfirmed, this scenario remains highly significant. It challenges the notion that terror birds were strictly denizens of an ancient, unreachable past. In reality, they existed within the fringes of our own epoch, standing just a brief geological span away from becoming adversaries that early humans might have encountered face to face. Far from representing an evolutionary dead end, the terror birds succeeded for tens of millions of years in doing exactly what nature demands of an apex hunter. They occupied the throne, acclimated to their surroundings, and asserted total command over the terrestrial food chain. In the context of the world they inhabited, they ranked among the most triumphant lineages in biological history. Their eventual demise was dictated not by a single foe, but by a planet that was evolving too rapidly for their specialized biology, a plummeting climate, the fragmentation of habitats, dwindling sustenance, and intensifying competition collectively rendered their once invincible survival strategy obsolete. It is vital to recognize that this decline was not marked by biological degeneration or inherent weakness. Rather, they simply emerged during a window when Earth still permitted the reign of giant ground-bound carnivores. In this sense, the terror birds represent the final historical instance where our planet flirted with returning the keys of power to the dinosaurs. They did not return in their ancestral, reptilian guise, but emerged anew in a silhouette that was no less formidable, a terrifying, avian reminder of once ruled the world.